So, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Friday, finally. Anyone doing anything fun this weekend? Yeah? What are you doing? It's so fun, you can't tell me, because I would stop you or call the police or something. That's how fun it is. It's so fun, it's illegal. Rose, doing anything fun? You haven't what? You haven't planned it yet? Hmm. B, Amanda, fun? Some horror movies? Yeah. Which ones have you planned it out?
It's up to Justin.
Oh, does he like horror movies? Do you like horror movies?
He just wants to watch it because it's October. Slasher movies.
Yeah. It's that time of year. Yeah. Ahmad, doing anything fun? No? Oh my
What
gosh.
about you?
I'm gonna go camping, actually.
Oh, look
I'm gonna go. What's that?
Because you're not a student.
Because I'm not a student. What do you mean?
Because
I have work to do too.
true, but you have a lot of deadlines.
Yeah, you do have a lot of deadlines. It's true. I'm gonna go just for tomorrow, tonight, and tonight we'll be at the campsite, and then tomorrow night we'll sleep over, and then we'll be there Sunday. So it's not a full weekend of camping. It's kind of like half a weekend, but that's okay. It'll be all right. Okay, so let's see. Let's see who's here. So Kevin is here. Good morning, Kevin. Mike is here. Good morning to you. Rafin is here. Good morning. Trung is here. Good morning to you. Ananda's here. Good morning, Ananda. And Shania is here. Good morning, Shania. And Michaela's here. Hello, Michaela. And Hadil is here. Good morning. Okay, so yesterday most of what we talked about was papers, right? And so we talked about Donald Trump. We talked about those two arguments about whether he was a fascist or not a fascist. You look very happy. Okay. We'll dig into it for you. We talked a little bit about Trump and the argument about whether we should see him as a fascist or whether we should not see him as a fascist. What's that?
Trump got
Yeah.
positive.
Yeah, Trump's got coronavirus.
Like, I'm so happy that, I keep seeing posts about that. Karma is back.
We'll see. We'll see how that goes. Yeah, I don't know what to say about that. Right. So we talked about that. We talked about paper stuff. We talked about finding good sources, and we talked about paraphrasing and what it was and what it wasn't, and how not to plagiarize because plagiarism is bad. And we talked a little bit about paper structure too, right? And so I showed you that I could take my simple argument, I could very quickly turn it into a paper outline, and that would work perfectly well, to communicate what I wanted to communicate. So I was encouraging you all to sort of follow that if you feel it's helpful to you. And of course, if you have your own process, then go with your own process. So today we transition back into history and into kind of the rise of Hitler, right? And so we've talked a little bit about the idea that at the end of World War I, we have these two brand new political systems, although you could probably argue that fascism is not necessarily a system, but either way, we have fascism and communism up here. Communism we'll deal with in just a little bit, and we'll deal with fascism and Hitler now. Let me ask you this, because most of us are familiar with Adolf Hitler, at least in reputation, even if we don't know everything about his life and what he did. we kind of know who he is, right? He's a cultural figure at the very least. Why is he so significant still? Why do people still talk about him? Because there's lots of political leaders throughout the 20th century that nobody's ever heard of and nobody cares about. But why are we still talking about this guy?
He's the one who helped Germany recover after the war.
Mm-hmm.
He was very strong
He-
and very influential.
Oh,
He started the Second World War.
okay, so he helps get Germany kind of back on its feet economically after the 1920s. Is a bit of a disaster, as we'll read. He's a strong leader. He's kind of a charismatic leader. He's very distinctive in his way of speaking, and even his, personal grooming style is very
And the mustache.
yeah, the mustache. So he's a very memorable character, even just to see. Never mind the things that he did. Ahmad, what did you say? You said he basically started the Second World War, right? Which, of course, we said in World War I, Germany was blamed for starting World War I. But in this case, I think they really do start World War II, don't they?
They didn't attack the French.
Hmm?
They didn't start anything with the French.
Well, yeah. I mean, let's leave that for now. Let's just he's one of the major factors in the beginning of World War II. We can at least, at minimum, we can say that. Ayushi's here too. Good morning, Ayushi. And Ryan is here. Good morning to you. Yeah, because he was the reason for World War II. Mm-hmm. Why else do you think we talk about this dude? Still, because we're looking at 90 years ago now. 90 years.
So we could say that the World War II ended, resulted in the beginning of the Cold War. That resulted in how the world is right now.
Okay, so we can kind of trace back the sort of geopolitical state of the world now. We can trace it back to the Cold War, and that can be traced back to World War II, which we said, of course, he is a major factor in, right? Why else? Why else are people? Why is he significant? Yeah, he presides over a pretty awful genocide. Not to say that other genocides aren't awful, because they are, of course. But this is one, I guess, that you could probably say that this is a genocide in which the Western world has a front row seat to it, right? There are other genocides that occurred around the world prior to that. There are quite a number of other genocides that have happened since the Holocaust, but this one is because the Western world is so heavily involved in World War II. The Western world has a front row seat to this genocide, and so they really get to see it in all its horror, kind of thing. And so, yeah, that is a pretty significant effect on certainly on the Western world as well. Why else? Any other reason, do you think? Why this guy is important? What's that?
They just like him.
Yeah, why? Why do they like him? What makes him notable or likable?
Because Germany had nothing, Germany was in a total loss and they didn't know what to do until they stepped up.
Yeah, so and maybe back to your earlier comment, he made Germany great again, right?
And then how he came to the power.
Right, so there's a story of how he gains power, which is maybe interesting and informative. Maybe it's a cautionary tale for those of us living in democracies who might not want them to slide into dictatorship, right? Maybe there's a cautionary tale there.
He was really good at
Um,
leadership.
He. He seems to have been. What's that?
Did he ever get married, Hitler?
Right before he died, he did.
Yeah?
Yeah.
He had babies?
What?
He had babies?
No, no time.
Oh.
Just like he married right now, 5 seconds later, the bullet was in his mouth. So.
Yeah. They married. He had a long time relationship with a woman I believe named Eva Braun, and then when it looked like they were going to lose the war, they were in a bunker apparently. They got married and then they committed suicide together.
Oh, they committed suicide together?
What? Yeah. So they lived happily ever after.
Hitler and
It's a bad joke, eh? That's a
They burned
horrible,
themselves, right?
horrible joke. What?
They burned themselves.
Well, no. I believe they shot themselves, and then apparently their bodies were burned.
Yeah, because nobody found their bodies.
No, actually, I have some slides. We have some remains of Hitler.
Can you show us?
Yep, Stalin's voice found.
I will show you. I will show you the gross pictures. They're not that gross. Don't worry. It's okay. What's that? You've seen where? Okay, you probably have. Okay, so clearly the fact that we know Hitler's name and we already know about him. I mean, yes, we've studied him in other classes or in the past, and so he's clearly still a notable figure nearly 100 years later. And again, I think it's fair to say that in 10 years he will continue to be a figure of note, right? A significant figure, and who knows for how long, right? Yeah, and so I think he will. Maybe we're jumping ahead here, but maybe he will continue to be important because of what he represents, right? He represents a time and a situation where a democratic country falls into dictatorship, right? It's where nationalism kind of runs rampant and becomes destructive. It's a period where that nationalism actually results in a genocide of millions and millions of people, right? And all of those things probably are not going away anytime soon, right? We should always pay attention and watch for and monitor places where genocide might happen. We should always, if we believe in democracy anyway, we should always try to safeguard our democracy and keep it away from people who might want to seize control. And so maybe even for those two reasons, maybe Hitler will always be an important historical figure, even just for those two things, never mind the fact that he's implicated in a world war, and that helps set the stage for the sort of geopolitical reality that we live in today, right? So maybe he'll always be significant. Maybe we'll never be rid of this guy, historically speaking anyway. Okay, so I know you saw my first slide there, so you know what's coming. I have just a few pages for you to read, and it occurs to me, online people, that I didn't post this yet, so I'm going to put it into Microsoft Teams in just 3 minutes. So just if you're online, just sit tight. I'm going to get that posted for you, and then you'll see it in just a few minutes. Okay, so if you're online, just be patient for a couple minutes and I'll post this, and if you're in class here, you can start reading, okay? Okay, online people, the pages that you need are now posted for you, okay? Okay, people. So let's talk about a few of these here. So as you can see, we're kind of picking up Germany's story right where we left it, which was at the end of the Treaty of Versailles, where Germany wasn't invited to the negotiating table. They had to sign the Treaty of Versailles, you know, without, you know, being allowed any input. And as we know that many of the German people were upset, right? Because they felt that they had been stabbed in the back by their government. They felt that other nations had dealt harshly with them, and they felt that they hadn't really lost the war, because in some ways they had not, right? They didn't technically lose. And so there's a lot of upset in Germany, and you can kind of see that in this point in the text. And so what is going on in Germany in the early 1920s? What's the state of affairs? What's the situation?
Recovering from the war.
What's that?
They're recovering from the
They're recovering from the war. Good. What else is happening?
other countries trying to make a rules or make a treaty.
Say that again?
Other countries were trying to tell the Germans to be out there.
Right. The Germans had to pay reparations, right, as a result of the Treaty of Versailles. And so the government, what's the government called? The Weimar Republic. Why is it called Weimar Republic?
Because I think it rose from the city.
That's a bit of trivia, but yeah. So it was centered in the city of Weimar, Germany. So they call it the Weimar government. It's a democratic government, and so this government is trying to figure out how to go about coming up with the money to pay these reparations. Because as we mentioned, many European countries are pretty much broke after the war, right? They've spent all their money, they've borrowed from other places, and they don't really have anything left in their bank accounts, and yet the German government has to figure out a way to make these reparation payments. It's stressful. What else is going on?
They have a lot of political unrest.
A lot of?
Political unrest.
A lot of political unrest. Okay, so describe that to me a little bit. Describe political unrest. Yeah, so the army still feels like it's been betrayed. The government is democratic, and so there's lots of smaller minority parties that are participating in this sort of democratic process, but they can't really agree. You know, things aren't getting passed, and so people are frustrated. And so how do people sort of try to take that political system into their own hands? I'll give you a hint with a putsch. Putsch. Yeah. How do people take that take the political system into their own hands, or try to? What do they try? What do some parties try to do, or some groups of people try to do?
They try to do some kind of like coups all across the country.
Yeah.
The socialists had some coups.
Yeah, there's lots of attempted coups, and so coup is spelt, because it's a French word, I believe, C-O-U-P, right? And so a coup, or a putsch, for if you want to use the German word, it's an attempted overthrow of the government, and usually by force, right? So usually you have people with guns storming into, government buildings and kicking the government out and arresting them and throwing them in jail. What's that? Sometimes it is. Sometimes it is. It depends on the. I don't know that a coup. I don't know that a coup necessarily means that the military has to be involved. Sometimes they are. Yeah, it's certainly the military is sometimes involved in a coup or a coup d'etat, if you will. Um, I don't know that, based on just the meaning of coup, I don't know that it necessarily has to be the military, but sometimes it is. You're definitely right, sometimes it is. So yeah, we have lots of groups, some on the left. We have some left-wing socialists and communists. We have some right-wing fascists, probably, or proto-fascists, early fascists, who try to overthrow the government by force, right? And who's one of those groups? It's the guy we're talking about. Yeah, it's Hitler's group, right? So his Nazi party, when it's kind of a lot smaller and a lot less well known, his group actually tries to overthrow the government as well. And he's unsuccessful in doing so. He winds up going to jail, but he tries to overthrow the government as well, right? So it's kind of a period of desperation and anger and frustration. There are armed people in the streets fighting with each other. There are people storming the Reichstag, the German or the Weimar government building, trying to take over. So stuff's pretty crazy, right? Like, if we look what's happening in the United States right now, it's pretty crazy down there, but nobody's overthrowing the government, right? Nobody's storming their way into the White House with guns. So you can only imagine the sort of chaos that they're experiencing down in the States at the moment is nowhere near the scale that Germany was experiencing at the time, right? There's fighting in the streets, there's attempted coups, there's well, I mean, maybe we should move on to number 16, because I think this kind of leads into it, is why are there so many crises or crises for this Weimar Republic? Why is the government struggle so much?
So one thing is that they have to pay a lot to the foreign countries, and that payment came from the property class, where they have to give up art, jewelry, and other stuff.
Yeah,
So they didn't feel like the government.
sure.
And they couldn't find their way back into the world market,
Right?
so they couldn't make any trade, they couldn't make the economy robust.
Okay, I'm going to stop you there for a second. So we've got two things, right? We've got the fact that they're trying to make these repayments, or reparations to the Allies. The first set of repayments gets made basically by taking money from rich people, right? So again, rich people don't really like to have their money confiscated by the government, but that's exactly what happens, right? So the government comes in and says, hey, we're taking all your fancy art and jewelry and maybe one of your many mansions, and we're going to sell them, and we're going to give the money to the Allies to make our reparation payments. So that goes over just about as well as you can imagine it going over, right? So they're unhappy.
German government.
Yeah, German government does that. And we said that they're trying to make some money on the world market, but of course, world markets aren't particularly friendly to German goods, right? So, what's that?
And then came the depression.
Yeah, but think about it for a second. So if you're a British person and you spent the last 4 years fighting the Germans, fighting the vile Hun, right? If you're fighting the Germans for 4 years and you lost a lot of your friends in the war, and then you go to the store and you see a couple things that you want to buy, and one's made in Britain and one's made in Germany, are you going to buy the one made in Germany? No, they're the bad guys, right? You're not buying German stuff. Are you kidding? So again, because they were the enemy, now they might want to sell their goods in all these European countries, but many European countries are like, no, we're not buying stuff made by the enemy. Forget it, right? So they have trouble kind of making money that way. They have trouble selling their goods on the market. Why was the Depression so kind of crushing for Germany?
So they were still kind of trying to recover from the ruins of the war,
Mm-hmm.
and they also took some short-term loans from the States.
Mm-hmm.
So
Exactly. So, sorry, just give me a second. I'm just going to look at something here really quickly.
What year was that when the depression came?
What, what year was that? 1929, or when the depression starts. Yeah, it's they're kind of easing into it in the late 20s, depending on where you are.
The war ended
1919, 18. Sorry.
so after 10 years, the Great Depression started.
What's that? Yeah,
10 years.
yeah. So, so Germany is already not in a good economic situation, right? And then the depression hits, and so all of the American money that was being pumped into Germany is now gone, right? And so their very fragile recovery collapses again, right? And it comes down hard. And so you can see that they're talking about unemployment rates of like 30, 40, 50%.
They said that 30, 40% in the States. Yeah, no, you're
That is crushing though. Like, does anyone know what the unemployment rate in Canada is right now, give or take?
Yeah, I think 14.
14?
I don't know.
less than 10, less than 5.
Less than 10, less than 5? What do you think it is? Unemployment rate in Canada?
Maybe less than 15.
Less than 15? It is in fact, and I haven't checked it recently, but it doesn't move. It's about,
5.65.
what is it?
5.67.
Yeah, it's usually between 4 and 6% in Canada, unemployment rate. If it starts to go to like 7 or 8, people start to get upset. Okay? So like if it goes to 7 or 8, people are like, "Oh boy, we're in trouble." So just imagine, if you will, a 30% unemployment rate. Like, that is crushing, right? That is 3 in 7 people do not have work, right? And so, and again, that's not 3 in 7 people, that's 3 in 7 people who would normally be in the workforce. So kids don't count, old people don't count either. So that's a huge number of people in the country who are not working and have no money. And so, again, I can't speak to all countries, but here in Canada, usually hovers between 4 and 6. 4 if we're doing well, 6 if we're not doing so well. If we're in kind of a bit of an economic recession, might go to 7, but if it climbs anywhere higher than 7 or 8, people start to get very nervous and uncomfortable. So again, imagine a 30 or 40% unemployment rate. Disaster, right? Total disaster. And again, even the US, who seems to be experiencing an amount of chaos at the moment, their unemployment rate, I think, is actually lower than ours.
No, currently it's 15.
No, it's not.
The April 2020 it's 15. Yeah, it was 7.9.
Maybe there was a short-term period during COVID. There's no way it's 15. 15 is like,
Yeah, it was 3.6.
yeah,
3.5.
there you go. So the United States is at 3.5 or 3.6. If they ever get to 15, it's going to be economic chaos down there. So again, you can imagine with 30 or 40% of people out of work, you have full-on emergency crisis, right? It's bad news. So the Weimar government's got all these issues to deal with, right? They've got these minority parties in parliament that cannot agree and cannot get stuff done. They've got these invoices, they've got these bills coming in from the Allies for reparations that they can't pay. Their economy is collapsing. Their loans that they're trying to get from the Americans eventually dry up because of the Depression. They can't pay anything. Nobody's working in Germany. They're, it seems like every couple weeks they've got people trying to storm in with guns and take over the government. It's a pretty stressful, chaotic time, right? It's tough to rule a country when you're dealing with all of these things at the same time, right? And we're not even going to mention Spanish influenza, which was still floating around in 1920 as well, right? So we won't even get into that. So the Weimar government is dealing with all of these kind of 4 alarm fires at the same time, right? I think we said, let me just see what we have here. Right, so what did the Americans do to try and solve these reparation problems? What's that? The Americans? Oh, it wasn't there? What did, well, because the Germans are having trouble making their reparation payments, so what did the Americans do? Yeah, they loaned them money, right? At a nice high interest rate, which is so very kind of the Americans, isn't it? Although I'm not sure. It says here in the text that
So just one thing, weren't the Germans supposed to pay the Americans anything?
I don't know that any of that reparation money went to the Americans. The Americans didn't really. I think it was kind of to pay back like damage for infrastructure and things like that, and so the Americans didn't really lose any of their infrastructure in the war. I'm not positive if any of that money went to the U.S. in that regard. I think most of it was supposed to go to France and to. But don't quote me on that. I'm not 100%. I'm not 100% sure. But in the text here at the top of page 43, it says these loans from the Americans were secured with attractive high interest rates. Usually high interest rates are not attractive. Usually it's the low interest rates that are attractive. So I don't know if the mistake there is that the interest rates were actually low and that made them attractive, or if the interest rates were high and they weren't attractive. I'm not really sure. But either way, the Americans decided to loan the Germans money to try to get them or allow them to continue making their reparation payments, right? But of course, we know when the stock market crashes in 1929, that money will dry up for the Germans and they'll be kind of in bad shape yet again. All right, let's take a little break, and then when we come back, we'll talk about Mr. Hitler. Okay? All right, take 10, come back, we'll talk. Okay, so we're back. We've established, of course, that at the end of the First World War, kind of moving into the mid-1920s, it's a chaotic period for Germany. There's political instability. There's attempted coups or putsches, however you want to say it. I don't speak German, obviously. There's attempted overthrows of the government. There is inflation and high unemployment, and all sorts of desperation and starving. And it's a tough time to be in Germany. And so the Weimar government, who the rich people don't like and the poor people don't like and really nobody likes, are desperately trying to sort of hold on to power and sort of govern the country of Germany. Yeah, and with kind of, I guess, reasonable success given the ridiculous situation that they're in. In terms of political stuff, what do you notice happening a lot in the Reichstag? They mention it a few times in this section of the textbook.
So they just said that no one had a majority government, they were all minority governments.
Right.
And the Nazis were getting more and more seats.
Right. So throughout the 1920s and into the 1930s, we see that we have lots of minority governments, and we said minority governments are not useless. I mean, in Canada right now, we have a minority government, and in British Columbia as well.
Useless for that.
Both. Well, it depends, right? It depends if the parties are working together, right? So, for example, in the States, if we look at their political system, we'll see that the two parties are not cooperating in any way, right? They are trying to basically destroy each other, which is unfortunate because with only two parties, you need to work together to some degree. Here in Canada and in British Columbia, we have minority governments. So Trudeau's Liberals have a minority in Ottawa, and John Horgan's New Democrats have a minority here in BC. And so we said that those kind of governments things happen more slowly. They're not able to do as many things because you don't have a majority of votes. You can't pass anything on your own. You always need the support of another.
Like the Ottawa and then the BC, they're the same.
Nope.
But they're both liberal.
Nope. One's NDP, one's Liberal.
Oh.
Right. So yeah, you need the support of another party. And so sometimes you'll see that they'll make a bit of an agreement. So here in BC, the NDPs were propped up by the Green Party. So the Green Party said, we'll support you, and that way you'll have a majority and you can do what you want as long as you do what we want. So sometimes you can have kind of a long-term agreement. Sometimes, like Trudeau will look around to see who will support him in his efforts, depending on what he's trying to pass, right? So he just did a throne speech, it's basically the government's plan for the next year or so. And in this case, the NDPs supported that throne speech, right? Because Trudeau threw in a few things that the NDP wanted. But either way, minority governments can work as long as all of the parties are willing to cooperate and kind of know how to. But if they don't really know how to, or if they don't want to cooperate, minority governments can be a disaster because nothing can get done. So here you see what the German parliament has is a lot of ruling by decree, okay? So the chancellor or the president is able to, if the Reichstag cannot come to an agreement on something, then they can rule by decree and say, this is what we're doing, the end, right? So there's kind of we see through the 1920s, there's a pattern of this happening, right? Where increasingly, and I think it's chancellors are ruling by decree because the political parties can't come to any sort of agreement. And so, is it chancellor or president?
No, the president was the same. The chancellor has kept changing.
Yeah, but who's ruling by decree? Chancellor. So increasingly throughout the 20s, the chancellor is just deciding things and that's it, right? So we kind of almost have a bit of not a dictatorship, but we have one person making the decisions, right? Which is not that great for a democracy, but that's kind of what's happening. And as you mentioned too, the Nazi Party is growing in popularity, right? So we said that, well, we didn't say, but the article we read said that, oh, you know, fascists don't like democracies, so how can you have a fascist in a democracy? But of course, here we have an entire party of fascists, Hitler's National Socialist Party or Nazi Party, entering the government by being elected. And every year, more and more of them are being elected to the point where they have not a majority of seats, but the most seats in the Reichstag, and they have about 30% of the vote, which honestly is that's what Justin Trudeau has right now. So, you know, the Nazis are popular with German people. The German people vote them in. So how does Hitler go about taking power here? How does he manage to go from nobody to Führer? Mm-hmm.
But he started some propaganda. The whole Nazis started propaganda campaigns, and they made some promises of purging from foreigners and Jews, getting rid of communist elements, and some other promises like that. So yeah, and they also started centralizing everything. So they moved after Hitler got in power, they moved the Reichstag from, I think it would have been in Weimar, they moved it to Berlin. They moved everything to Berlin. They controlled everything except for the church and the military. The church remained as it is.
Mm-hmm.
They're not the Jewish, but they're on the military. And yeah, by just propaganda and giving some promises, they gained more and more seats until Hitler was replaced. I think the president replaced him with the chancellor, and then he started doing all the things. And then the president died, and then he joined the two offices together, in which he also gained control over the military. So he basically became the Führer then.
Right. So Hitler's Nazis are kind of growing and growing in power. They've got a lot of public support, and actually we can talk about that in a little bit. But arguably, in large part, due to Hitler himself. Maybe we'll talk about this a little bit more next week. But you got to hand it to Hitler for marketing and branding, because the guy knows what he's doing, right? And so, you know, prior to, you know, well, not prior to, but even the period in which the Nazis are in power, they're very identifiable, right? They have a uniform, they've got kind of the brown, you know, combat fatigues, they've got, you know, the flag with the red and the swastika and a symbol, and he, of course, is very distinctive with his little mustache and his hair. So the Nazis are very good at branding, right? There's no doubt when they walk into the room who they are. And so Hitler's not only good at branding, but he's also good at rallies. And so we can see Donald Trump holding rallies in the United States quite frequently. His are ridiculous. Hitler is a master of staging, and so he would hold them in these big sort of outdoor amphitheaters at night, and so his soldiers would march in, and there'd be, you know, like a marching band music, and then there'd be floodlights that like stretched up to the sky, and so it would be it'd be a spectacle, right? It would be like half political rally, half rock concert, if you will. And so Hitler was much better. Trump, like, he doesn't know what he's doing, but Hitler was much better at staging these, you know, very powerful spectacles, right? And of course he would speak at them, and he was a charismatic speaker, and there was the uniforms and the flags and the whole thing. And so again, he took his branding and marketing much further than most political parties did. And so the German people like what they hear from Hitler, and he's such a he's such a force, right? He's so easily identifiable, and the message is identifiable, and the logos and the whole thing. And again, he winds up getting a lot of support. And then he finds himself in the office of chancellor, right? And of course, it's mentioned in the text that the hope was that he was in kind of a coalition government where he would have to, he would be sort of kept in check by other political parties, right? Because, what's that? They knew he was a radical. I feel like Chiffon and Adele and Aliana, what are you doing? Are you listening to me, or are you doing something else? Or, I feel like people knew he was very radical. Many people didn't like him. I'm going to jump ahead a few slides here. To this one? Nope. To this one? Well, here he is. I'll come back to that in a second. So I'm going to jump ahead here. So he was radical all the way along, okay? And so his views were never really hidden from the public. People kind of always knew who he was and what he was about. But again, the political leaders of the time either overlooked it or thought they could kind of, keep a short leash on him and make sure he didn't get into too much trouble. But of course, they were quite wrong in doing that, right? And so after that beer hall putsch, after that attempt to overthrow the government by the Nazis, and they get caught and a few people get shot, Hitler goes to jail for a short period of time. But while he's there, he writes this book called Mein Kampf, which is My Struggle. And so in it, he kind of, he says a lot of things. If we had a little more time, I'd get you to read some of it. It's rambling insanity is pretty much what it is for a book. It's not very well structured, but it's kind of rambling insanity. But in it, you kind of hear all the major elements of his ideology, right? The ideology that the German people are kind of superior, the idea that Germany needed to take land from its neighbors in order to gain living space, which we'll talk about next week. His idea that Jewish people and Bolsheviks were kind of in league or kind of one and the same, and they were kind of controlling the world, and they needed to be kind of battled and sort of removed from German society. All those things are right there in the book. And so, again, it's the things that kind of Hitler should not have been a surprise to anyone, because he really didn't keep them a secret. But then again, we should point out that some of his views, like that Lebensraum thing and his sort of anti-Semitic views against Jewish people, those weren't strange for the day. A lot of people were anti-Semitic in Europe at the time. And so Hitler definitely wasn't the only one, and there was probably lots of people who sympathized with those views. So, and how does he come to power? The Enabling Act. What happens with the Enabling Act?
This is the party to pass the Enabling Act.
Mm-hmm.
Only one party, the Communist Party, votes against it.
Yeah.
Then the Reichstag conveniently burns, and they get blamed.
Right, but we'll get to that in a minute. What does the Enabling Act do, though?
He gets to rule by the big players.
Yeah, so the Enabling Act gives the Chancellor, gives Hitler, the power to rule independent of the Reichstag for 4 years, right? And so, that basically makes him a temporary dictator, right? Because he's got full power. The Reichstag can vote however they want. He doesn't have to listen to them. He just makes decisions, and that's what happens, right? And so that gets voted in, And then what's the next thing he does? He makes all other political parties illegal. He makes all trade unions illegal. And like you mentioned, he starts to centralize the government very, very quickly. And so, yeah, that Enabling Act is kind of the last sort of barrier in his way, right? Because once he gets that, he can do whatever he wants for 4 years. But after 4 years, after 1 year, there won't be anyone left to oppose him, right? And so it's kind of interesting because, you know, this is the fascist democratic thing where, you know, oh, well, you can't have a fascist in democracy. Not only can you have a fascist in democracy, but Democrats can give the fascists their power, right? So the Reichstag here, when they vote in the Enabling Act, they basically give the keys to Hitler and say, here, do what you want, right? And he does. That's exactly what he does. He does what he wants. And so, again, he doesn't seize power in any way. The power is given to him by the assembly. Granted, most of the people in the assembly are his supporters, right, are the Nazi party, but still, democracy is what gives the keys to this dictator, right? Not, you know, he doesn't walk in with an army or, you know, he doesn't threaten anyone. They vote it through. And then, again, once they give him the power to act independently, it's all over, right? And so immediately he starts limiting, and we'll see this next week, immediately he starts limiting civil liberties for Jewish people. Immediately he moves the government. Immediately he abolishes political parties and trade unions. And yeah, and then it's too late, right? It's very quickly too late to start kind of trying to keep control of him because he's loose now, right? He's loose. What's that? Yeah, so how did Hitler end up using the swastika for his party, Ayushi says, when the symbol itself is Hindu in origin? Yeah, and so I think the Hindu or the Sanskrit version of the swastika, I believe, is the opposite way. I don't know, and if anyone actually knows this, that would be interesting. I don't know if I think he might have come up with it on his own. Or he may have seen it somewhere. It's possible too.
So one thing I heard was that the swastika, it's like a symbol to control the 4 elements.
In the original kind of the Indian meaning, or is that what he?
I think that
That's possible. I don't know that that's what he. I don't know that that's how he imagined it. I actually don't know. I don't know where he came up with the symbol. I don't know if he saw the original version and flipped it, or if he somehow designed it himself just by accident.
That's very different.
I don't know. It's a simple enough symbol that you would think that somebody could invent it on their own, right? It's not super complex, but I don't know. I don't know how he comes across it, but he does, right?
Yeah, I think it's taken from Hinduism. They have the same symbol without the dots.
It's very similar, right? It's just a flip, right? But again, if maybe he sees it somewhere and he uses it, or maybe who knows?
It's a Hitler.
Who knows?
Do whatever he wants.
Well, I mean, there's no copyright law at the time, right? So you can kind of get away with that. Okay, so I think what I'll do is I'll leave it there. I have some video to show you. I have some more stuff I want you to read, but I think I'm just going to leave it there because it's Friday, and Amanda looks like she's ready for the weekend already, even though she's not there yet. Okay, so online people, I'll leave it there. I hope you have a good weekend. Work on your papers. If you have questions, you can message me, and I will see you on Monday.